The morning sun cast long shadows across the gardens of Clarence's house as Charles stood by the window, watching the groundskeepers tend to the roses that Camilla had so carefully planned years ago. The irony wasn't lost on him that these very flowers, once symbols of their enduring love, now seemed to mock the emptiness he felt in their marriage. At 75, the king found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about love, duty, and the choices that had shaped his life. The previous evening had been particularly difficult. Camilla had retired early again, citing another headache, leaving Charles alone in the drawing room with only his thoughts for company. It had become a pattern over the past months: polite conversation at public events, separate schedules, and growing emotional distance that felt as vast as the Scottish Highlands. He wondered when they had stopped truly seeing each other, when their conversations had become mere exchanges of necessary information rather than the intimate sharing that had once defined their relationship. Catherine's recent visit to discuss the children's summer activities had lingered in his mind long after she had departed. There was something about the way she spoke about George, Charlotte, and Louis that reminded him of Diana's fierce maternal instincts, but with a warmth and stability that his first wife had struggled to maintain. Catherine possessed a quiet strength that had always impressed him, but lately he found himself noticing other qualities: her genuine laughter when Louis had spilled juice on his shirt, her thoughtful questions about his charitable work, the way she listened with complete attention when he shared his concerns about the monarchy's future. The king had always prided himself on his sense of duty above all else. His marriage to Camilla had been born from decades of love and understanding, a relationship that had weathered numerous storms and public scrutiny. She had been his constant companion through the darkest periods of his life, understanding the burdens of his position in ways that few others could. Yet something fundamental had shifted in recent months, something he couldn't quite name but felt deeply in his bones. Perhaps it had begun during the Christmas celebrations at Sandringham. While Camilla had seemed increasingly withdrawn, preferring the company of her own children and grandchildren, Catherine had naturally gravitated toward Charles during family discussions. Her insights about modernizing certain royal traditions had impressed him, as had her genuine concern for his well-being during a particularly stressful week dealing with parliamentary issues. She had a way of asking the right questions, of listening without judgment, that reminded him of conversations he used to have with his beloved grandmother, the Queen Mother. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Charles found himself looking forward to Catherine's presence at family gatherings, appreciating her calm demeanor during tense moments, and valuing her opinion on matters both personal and professional. She had grown from the nervous young woman who had first entered their family into a confident, capable individual who understood the weight of royal responsibility while maintaining her authentic self. Her children clearly adored their grandfather, and Charles found genuine joy in their uninhibited affection. Meanwhile, his relationship with Camilla had become increasingly strained. Their shared history, once a source of strength, now felt like a burden. Every conversation seemed to circle back to old grievances, past decisions, and the weight of public opinion that had never fully accepted their union. Camilla's own struggles with the role of queen consort had created additional tension. She often spoke of feeling like an outsider, despite years of dedicated service, and her frustration had begun to affect their private moments together. The king remembered a particular conversation with Catherine just weeks ago when she had asked about his environmental initiatives with such genuine interest that they had talked for over an hour. Her questions were insightful, her suggestions practical, and her enthusiasm reminded him why he had been so passionate about these causes in the first place. When Camilla had joined them later, the dynamic had shifted noticeably. Where Catherine brought energy and fresh perspectives, Camilla's presence seemed to dampen the conversation, her responses polite but distant. Charles found himself comparing the two women more frequently than he cared to admit. Camilla's worldly sophistication, which had once attracted him, now felt calculated. Catherine's natural grace and genuine warmth created an atmosphere where he felt more like himself, not just the king, but Charles the man. With Catherine, conversations flowed easily between serious topics and light-hearted family matters. She made him laugh in ways he hadn't experienced in years, and her presence brought a peace he hadn't realized he was missing. The king's internal struggle intensified as he recognized these feelings growing stronger. His marriage to Camilla had been a triumph of love over protocol, a declaration that personal happiness could coexist with royal duty. To question that decision now felt like betraying not just Camilla, but his own principles. Yet he couldn't ignore the emotional awakening he experienced whenever Catherine was near, the way his heart lifted when he heard her voice in the corridor, the anticipation he felt before family gatherings where she would be present. Professional interactions provided more opportunities for Charles to appreciate Catherine's qualities. During recent meetings about the prince's trust and other charitable organizations, her thoughtful contributions had impressed not just him, but his closest advisors. She asked penetrating questions about program effectiveness and suggested innovative approaches to reaching underserved communities. Her background in photography and art history brought fresh insights to discussions about cultural initiatives, and her natural empathy made her suggestions about community outreach particularly valuable. The king began to recognize that his feelings for Catherine extended far beyond admiration for her role as William's wife and mother to his grandchildren. There was an intellectual connection that stimulated him, an emotional resonance that had been missing from his life for longer than he cared to acknowledge. She challenged him in the best ways, encouraging him to consider different perspectives while never making him feel criticized or diminished. In her presence, he felt more energetic, more optimistic about the future, more connected to his own humanity. One particularly memorable evening, Charles and Catherine had found themselves alone in the library at Windsor Castle while the rest of the family was engaged in other activities. Their conversation had ranged from books they had both read to their hopes for the children's futures, from philosophical discussions about leadership to shared memories of family moments. The easy intimacy of that exchange had left Charles feeling simultaneously exhilarated and deeply troubled. He had gone to bed that night knowing that his feelings for Catherine had crossed a line from familial affection into something much more profound and problematic. The weight of his position made these emerging feelings even more complicated. As king, every personal decision had public implications. His marriage to Camilla had already required the nation to accept significant changes to royal tradition. The idea of another dramatic shift in his personal life would undoubtedly create unprecedented challenges for the monarchy. Yet he couldn't deny the growing certainty that his heart was leading him toward Catherine, despite all the reasons why such feelings were impossible to act upon. Charles knew that the coming weeks would require him to make some of the most difficult decisions of his life. The comfortable routines that had defined his marriage to Camilla were no longer sustainable, not when every interaction highlighted the emotional distance between them. At the same time, his feelings for Catherine were becoming increasingly difficult to hide, especially from himself. The king found himself standing at a crossroads that would define not just his personal happiness, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. As he turned away from the window, Charles caught sight of a photograph on his desk, a recent family portrait taken at Trooping the Color. Camilla stood beside him with her practiced smile, while Catherine's genuine joy radiated from the image. Even in a photograph, the difference in their emotional presence was unmistakable. The king realized that he could no longer pretend that his marriage was anything more than a well-performed public partnership, while his heart yearned for the authentic connection he felt with Catherine. The morning light continued to stream through the windows of Clarence House, but, for Charles, it felt like the dawn of an entirely new chapter in his life. The choices ahead would require courage he wasn't sure he possessed, but the alternative, continuing to live a lie while his heart pulled him in another direction, seemed even more impossible to bear. The king understood that he was about to embark on a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, duty, and the delicate balance between personal happiness and public responsibility. The state banquet for the visiting Australian Prime Minister should have been a routine affair, the kind of formal diplomatic event that Charles had managed countless times throughout his decades of public service. Yet as he stood in the receiving line at Buckingham Palace, greeting dignitaries with practiced ease, his attention kept drifting to Catherine. She moved through the room with an effortless elegance that made even the most elaborate protocol seem natural and welcoming. Her conversations with foreign officials were marked by genuine curiosity about their countries and cultures, and Charles found himself listening to her interactions with growing admiration. Camilla, standing beside him in the receiving line, performed her duties with professional competence, but there was a mechanical quality to her interactions that had become increasingly apparent over recent months. She smiled appropriately, said the right things, and maintained the dignified presence expected of a queen consort, but the warmth that had once characterized her public appearances seemed forced. Charles noticed how foreign dignitaries responded differently to Catherine's natural charm compared to Camilla's more formal approach, and the contrast troubled him more than he wanted to admit. During the formal dinner, Charles found himself seated where protocol demanded, between the Prime Minister's wife and the Canadian High Commissioner, while Catherine was positioned several seats away with a group of cultural attaches and trade representatives. Despite the distance, he found his gaze drawn to her table repeatedly throughout the evening. Her animated discussions about British art collections with the museum directors in attendance created a lively atmosphere that seemed to energize everyone around her. When she laughed at something the Australian arts minister had shared, the genuine joy in her expression made Charles's heart skip in a way that surprised him with its intensity. The king's distraction didn't go unnoticed. His private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, who had served the royal family for decades and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read his employer's moods, later approached him with carefully chosen words about maintaining proper focus during state functions. Charles appreciated the gentle warning, but found it impossible to fully concentrate on diplomatic conversations when Catherine's presence in the room created such a powerful pull on his attention. After the formal toasts and speeches, guests moved to the music room for entertainment provided by the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. It was during this more relaxed portion of the evening that Charles found an opportunity to speak privately with Catherine. They stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, ostensibly discussing the musical program, but their conversation naturally drifted to more personal topics. Catherine mentioned how much the children had enjoyed their recent afternoon with him at Highgrove, particularly George's fascination with the organic farming techniques Charles had shown him. Their discussion revealed layers of connection that went far beyond their family relationship. Catherine's thoughtful questions about sustainable agriculture led to a passionate exchange about environmental policy, while her insights about balancing public duty with family life resonated deeply with Charles's own ongoing struggles. When she mentioned reading one of his books about traditional crafts, her detailed comments proved she had engaged with the material seriously, not merely as a polite gesture. The intellectual stimulation of their conversation, combined with her obvious respect for his ideas and accomplishments, created an intimacy that felt both natural and dangerous. The evening's most challenging moment came when Camilla approached their small group near the windows. Her timing seemed calculated to interrupt what had clearly become an absorbing private conversation between Charles and Catherine. The Queen Consort's polite smile didn't quite mask her irritation, and her subsequent comments about the lateness of the hour and the need to conclude the evening felt pointed. Catherine gracefully excused herself to speak with other guests, but not before she and Charles exchanged a look that conveyed more understanding than words could have expressed. The ride back to Clarence House with Camilla was conducted in tense silence. Charles found himself reliving moments from the evening. Catherine's laugh, the way she had listened so intently to his thoughts about architectural preservation, the natural grace with which she had navigated complex social dynamics. Meanwhile, Camilla stared out the window of their official car, her body language suggesting frustration that she was clearly struggling to contain. When they finally arrived home, she immediately retired to her private rooms without the usual brief conversation about the evening's events. Charles spent the next several hours in his study, ostensibly reviewing briefing papers for the following day's appointments, but actually replaying every moment of his interaction with Catherine. He found himself analyzing the warmth in her voice when she had asked about his upcoming trip to Wales, the genuine interest she had shown in his environmental initiatives, and the easy chemistry that had made their conversation flow so naturally. These weren't casual family exchanges anymore. They were the kind of deep, meaningful conversations he had been missing for months in his marriage. The king's emotional turmoil was compounded by his growing recognition that Catherine seemed to reciprocate at least some measure of his feelings. Her attention during their conversations was complete and focused in ways that suggested more than polite family interest. She remembered details from previous discussions, asked follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine engagement with his ideas, and seemed to seek out opportunities for private conversation during family gatherings. Whether she was conscious of the shift in their dynamic remained unclear, but Charles couldn't ignore the signs that their relationship was evolving beyond conventional boundaries. Professional obligations over the following days provided more opportunities for Charles to observe Catherine's qualities and to recognize how profoundly she affected him. During a charity event for one of his environmental foundations, she had volunteered to help coordinate media coverage, bringing both her professional background in photography and her natural understanding of public relations to bear on the project. Her suggestions for highlighting the human impact of their conservation work were both creative and practical, leading to some of the most effective publicity the organization had received in years. More significantly, Catherine's interactions with the young volunteers at the environmental event revealed aspects of her character that Charles found deeply moving. She spent considerable time listening to their concerns about climate change and their hopes for making a difference through the Foundation's work. Her ability to connect with people across different age groups and backgrounds, combined with her obvious passion for causes close to Charles's heart, made him realize that she shared not just his interests but his fundamental values about service and responsibility. The king found himself imagining what it would be like to work alongside Catherine on a regular basis, to have her insights and energy contributing to the causes he cared about most. These daydreams felt both inspiring and torturous, given the impossibility of acting on such fantasies. Yet he couldn't stop himself from envisioning a partnership that went far beyond their current family connection, a true collaboration between two people who understood each other's strengths and shared similar visions for their work. His relationship with Camilla, meanwhile, continued its steady decline. Their conversations had become perfunctory exchanges of necessary information, lacking the emotional connection that had sustained them through decades of challenges. Camilla's increasing isolation within the family dynamic was evident to Charles, but his attempts to bridge the growing gap felt forced and artificial. When they attended events together, they performed their public roles competently, but the private moments between them were marked by awkward silences and unspoken tensions. The queen consort's own struggles with her position had become more pronounced in recent months. She frequently complained about the constant scrutiny, the impossible expectations, and the sense that she would never be truly accepted by the British public. These conversations, once opportunities for Charles to provide comfort and reassurance, now felt burdensome. His emotional energy was increasingly focused on his feelings for Catherine, leaving little capacity for supporting Camilla through her ongoing challenges. Charles began to recognize that his marriage had become a performance for both of them, a careful maintenance of appearances that served public expectations but provided little personal fulfillment. The realization was painful, given their long history together and the sacrifices they had both made to be together. Yet he couldn't deny that his heart was pulling him in an entirely different direction, toward a connection that felt more authentic and life-giving than anything he had experienced in years. The complexity of his situation was overwhelming at times. As king, he bore responsibility not just for his own happiness, but for the stability of the monarchy and the expectations of the nation. His personal choices had far-reaching implications that extended well beyond his private feelings. Yet the growing strength of his emotional connection to Catherine made it increasingly difficult to maintain the status quo. Every interaction with her reinforced his sense that they shared something special, while every day with Camilla highlighted the emotional distance that had grown between them. Standing in his private study late one evening, looking at photographs from recent family events, Charles could clearly see the progression of his feelings reflected in these captured moments. Early photos showed him treating Catherine with the fond affection appropriate for a daughter-in-law. More recent images revealed something deeper. The way he leaned toward her during conversations, the genuine smile that crossed his face when she spoke, the body language that suggested a connection that went far beyond family politeness. The king understood that he was approaching a point where these feelings would become impossible to hide, both from himself and from others. The question that kept him awake at night was whether he had the courage to acknowledge what was happening in his heart, and, if so, what he was prepared to do about it. The safe path was to suppress these feelings and work to restore his marriage with Camilla, but Charles was beginning to doubt whether that was even possible, given how profoundly his emotional landscape had shifted. As he prepared for bed that night, Charles made a decision that would shape everything that followed. He would no longer pretend that his feelings for Catherine were merely familial. He would acknowledge to himself that something profound was happening, something that challenged everything he thought he knew about love and loyalty. What he would do with that acknowledgement remained unclear, but he could no longer live in denial about the truth of his own heart. The private meeting Charles had requested with Catherine under the pretense of discussing the children's summer education took place in the Oak Room at Windsor Castle on a gray Tuesday morning. He had chosen this particular room deliberately, smaller than the formal reception areas, with comfortable seating arranged around a fireplace that created an atmosphere more suited to personal conversation than official business. Catherine arrived precisely on time, carrying a folder of materials about various educational programs, clearly prepared for what she believed would be a straightforward family discussion. Charles found himself unusually nervous as he watched her settle into the chair across from him, her natural grace evident even in such simple movements. She wore a navy dress that complemented her complexion and conveyed appropriate respect for their meeting, yet nothing about her appearance seemed calculated or artificial. This authenticity, which had always attracted him, now made his heart race in ways that reminded him of his youth, when such feelings had seemed both simpler and more terrifying. The first 20 minutes of their conversation proceeded as Catherine had expected, with detailed discussions about George's aptitude for history, Charlotte's growing interest in languages, and Louis's need for more structured activities that could channel his abundant energy. Catherine's insights into her children's personalities and learning styles impressed Charles, as did her thoughtful approach to balancing their royal heritage with normal childhood experiences. Her desire to give them a sense of duty while protecting their innocence reflected values that aligned perfectly with his own beliefs about raising future members of the royal family. However, as their conversation continued, Charles found it increasingly difficult to maintain the pretense that his interest was purely grandfatherly. Catherine's passion for her children's well-being, her detailed knowledge of educational philosophy, and her obvious dedication to their development revealed depths of character that moved him profoundly. When she spoke about wanting them to understand their responsibilities while remaining connected to ordinary people's experiences, her words echoed his own struggles to balance royal duty with human authenticity. The turning point came when Catherine mentioned feeling sometimes isolated in her role, uncertain whether she was making the right decisions about the children's upbringing. Her vulnerability in sharing these concerns created an opening for Charles to respond with his own experiences of doubt and uncertainty during William and Harry's childhood. As their conversation shifted to more personal territory, the formality that usually characterized their interactions began to dissolve, replaced by the kind of intimate exchange usually reserved for the closest relationships. Charles found himself sharing thoughts and feelings he had never expressed to anyone, including his regrets about mistakes made during his son's upbringing and his fears about whether he was providing adequate guidance as both father and king. Catherine listened with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions and offering perspectives that demonstrated her deep understanding of the unique challenges facing their family. Her empathy and insight made Charles feel understood in ways that had been missing from his life for longer than he cared to acknowledge. When Catherine reached across the small table between them to touch his hand briefly in response to something particularly painful he had shared about Harry's estrangement from the family, the simple gesture of comfort created an electric moment of connection that neither of them could ignore. The touch lasted only a few seconds, but the emotional impact was profound. Charles saw recognition in Catherine's eyes that their relationship had entered new territory, followed immediately by confusion and concern about the implications of what was happening between them. The conversation that followed this moment of physical connection was marked by careful navigation around feelings that both of them were beginning to acknowledge, but neither was prepared to address directly. Catherine's increased nervousness was evident in the way she began gathering her materials more frequently and checking the time, while Charles found himself speaking more quickly, as if trying to hold on to these precious moments of authentic connection before they ended. Both seemed to understand that they were approaching dangerous emotional territory while being unable to resist the pull they felt toward each other. Catherine's attempt to return their discussion to safer ground by focusing on practical arrangements for the children's summer activities was undermined by the new awareness that had been awakened between them. Every exchange now carried layers of meaning that extended far beyond the surface topics they were discussing. When Charles suggested that he might personally oversee some of George's historical education, Catherine's response revealed her pleasure at the prospect of additional time together, even as she struggled to keep her reaction appropriate to their family relationship. The meeting concluded with both participants understanding that something fundamental had changed between them, though neither was prepared to name what that meant. As Catherine prepared to leave, Charles found himself extending their time together by walking her to her car personally, something he had never done before. Their conversation during this brief walk was stilted and awkward, both of them hyper-aware of every word and gesture while trying to maintain normal family politeness. The days following their private meeting were marked by increased tension for both Charles and Catherine. The king found himself replaying every moment of their conversation, analyzing Catherine's responses for signs of reciprocal feelings while simultaneously feeling guilty about his growing emotional investment in his daughter-in-law. His ability to concentrate on official duties suffered noticeably, with his private secretary commenting on his unusual distractedness during important briefings. Catherine's own emotional turmoil became apparent to those closest to her, though she struggled to understand and manage feelings that seemed to have appeared suddenly, yet felt increasingly powerful. Her sister Pippa noticed changes in Catherine's behavior during a family lunch, particularly her tendency to bring conversations around to topics related to Charles's interests and activities. When asked directly about her increased involvement in the king's charitable work, Catherine's responses were defensive in ways that suggested her own confusion about her motivations. The next significant interaction between Charles and Catherine occurred during a family dinner at Sandringham, where the presence of other family members created both safety and frustration. They found themselves positioned at opposite ends of the table, yet their awareness of each other was constant throughout the meal. Charles noticed how Catherine's contributions to dinner conversation were often directed toward him, seeking his opinion on topics and responding to his comments with particular attention. Similarly, he realized that his own remarks were increasingly aimed at drawing responses from Catherine, creating a subtle but persistent dialogue across the crowded table. William's presence at the dinner added complexity to the emotional undercurrents that Charles and Catherine were managing. As the meal progressed, both became increasingly aware of the ethical implications of their growing connection. Catherine's divided attention between her husband's family conversation and her special responsiveness to Charles created internal conflict that was difficult to hide completely. Charles, meanwhile, struggled with feelings of guilt about his emotional involvement with his son's wife, even as he found it impossible to suppress his growing attachment to her. The evening's most difficult moment came when Camilla made pointed comments about recent changes in family dynamics, observations that seemed directed specifically at the subtle shift in how Charles and Catherine interacted. Her remarks about loyalty and appropriate boundaries, while ostensibly general commentary, carried clear implications that made both Charles and Catherine uncomfortable. The Queen Consort's increasing awareness of her husband's emotional distance had sharpened her sensitivity to his behavior patterns, and she was beginning to identify concerning changes. After the family dinner, Charles spent a sleepless night wrestling with the full implications of his feelings for Catherine. His emotional connection to her had grown beyond his ability to rationalize or control, yet acting on these feelings would create unprecedented chaos for the monarchy and devastate multiple relationships. His love for William, his respect for Catherine as a mother and individual, and his sense of duty to the crown all pointed toward suppressing these emotions. However, his heart refused to cooperate with his rational mind's attempts at emotional discipline. Catherine faced her own crisis of conscience in the days following the Sandringham dinner. Her growing attraction to Charles contradicted everything she believed about loyalty, marriage, and family responsibility. Yet she couldn't deny that her feelings were real and strengthening, despite all logical reasons to resist them. Her conversations with Charles stimulated her intellectually and emotionally in ways that reminded her of the early days of her relationship with William, before the pressures of royal life had created distance between them. The realization that both Charles and Catherine were struggling with similar feelings became apparent during a chance encounter in the corridors of Buckingham Palace several days later. Catherine had come for a meeting with her charitable foundation coordinators, while Charles was leaving a session with constitutional advisors. Their brief conversation about routine family matters was charged with unspoken awareness of their mutual emotional conflict. The careful distance they maintained physically contrasted sharply with the intensity of their eye contact and the subtle tremor in Catherine's voice when she spoke his name. This encounter forced both of them to acknowledge that their feelings were mutual and growing stronger rather than diminishing with time. The recognition created both relief and terror, as it validated the authenticity of their connection while highlighting the impossibility of pursuing it within the constraints of their family relationships and public responsibilities. Neither was prepared to take steps that would fundamentally alter their circumstances, yet both found it increasingly difficult to pretend that nothing had changed between them. Charles began making subtle inquiries about Catherine's happiness in her marriage, carefully probing family members for information about how she was adjusting to royal life and whether she seemed fulfilled in her role. These conversations, disguised as grandfatherly concern, revealed his growing desire to understand Catherine's emotional state and potentially identify any dissatisfaction that might create opportunities for deeper connection. The dangerous nature of this emotional territory was becoming clear to him, yet he felt powerless to resist his need to understand her better. Meanwhile, Catherine found herself paying increased attention to Charles's interactions with Camilla, observing the formality and emotional distance that characterized their public appearances together. Her heart responded with both sympathy for Charles's apparent isolation and hope that his marriage might be less fulfilling than public perception suggested. These thoughts frightened her with their implications, yet she couldn't stop herself from analyzing every detail of the royal couple's relationship dynamic. The king's emotional crisis deepened as he realized that his feelings for Catherine had moved beyond attraction or admiration into something approaching love. This recognition terrified him, as it suggested that his current life structure was fundamentally unsustainable. The prospect of continuing to suppress these feelings indefinitely seemed impossible, yet the alternative, acknowledging and potentially acting on them, threatened to destroy everything he had built over decades of service to the crown. As the third phase of Charles's emotional journey concluded, both he and Catherine understood that they were approaching a point where their feelings would become impossible to hide from family members and close observers. The intensity of their connection was growing beyond their ability to manage discreetly, while their attempts to maintain normal family relationships were becoming increasingly strained. Neither had any clear vision of how to resolve the impossible situation they had created, yet both felt powerless to step back from the emotional precipice they were approaching together. The crisis that would ultimately force Charles's hand began with what should have been a routine family celebration: Prince George's 11th birthday party at Kensington Palace. The intimate gathering included only close family members, creating an atmosphere where careful emotional boundaries became harder to maintain. Charles arrived with an elaborate gift he had personally selected for his grandson, a rare collection of historical maps that reflected both his knowledge of George's interests and his desire to make a meaningful connection through the child he shared with Catherine. Catherine's response to his thoughtful gift was warm and grateful in ways that felt deeply personal. Her appreciation went beyond the appropriate gratitude expected from a mother receiving an expensive present for her child. She understood the care and attention Charles had invested in selecting something so perfectly suited to George's developing passion for geography and history. When she mentioned that George had specifically asked for his grandfather's advice about famous historical explorers just weeks earlier, Charles realized that Catherine had been sharing details of their son's conversations with him, creating a level of family intimacy that felt both natural and dangerous. The party itself proceeded normally, with the usual chaos of children's activities and adult conversation. However, Charles found himself gravitating toward Catherine throughout the afternoon, seeking opportunities for brief private exchanges while maintaining appropriate social distance. Their shared glances across the room and moments of quiet conversation near the garden windows created a subtle but persistent connection that both sustained and tormented him. When Catherine laughed at something he whispered about George's serious expression while examining the historical maps, her genuine delight made his heart race in ways that reminded him of being a young man falling in love for the first time. The afternoon's most significant moment came when Catherine asked Charles to help her carry additional refreshments from the kitchen, creating their first opportunity for completely private conversation in weeks. Away from the oversight of family members, their interaction immediately became more intimate and charged with unspoken emotion. Catherine thanked him again for the gift, but her words carried layers of meaning that extended far beyond appreciation for a birthday present. When she mentioned how much George valued his relationship with his grandfather and how important Charles had become to all the children, her voice held an emotional weight that suggested much more personal feelings. Charles responded by sharing how much his relationship with Catherine and her children meant to him, how their presence in his life had brought joy and purpose that he had been missing for longer than he cared to acknowledge. As they stood close together in the kitchen, ostensibly arranging fruit and sandwiches on serving trays, the physical proximity created an electric awareness that neither could ignore. When Catherine reached past him for a plate, and their bodies briefly made contact, the moment of connection was so intense that both immediately stepped back, overwhelmed by feelings they were no longer able to rationalize as merely familial. Their return to the party required careful management of expressions and behavior, but both were visibly affected by their kitchen encounter. William noticed his wife's heightened emotional state and asked if everything was all right, while Camilla observed her husband's obvious distraction with growing suspicion. The Queen Consort had been monitoring Charles's behavior closely for weeks, noting his increased interest in family gatherings and his tendency to position himself near Catherine during group conversations. Her mounting concerns about her husband's emotional involvement with their daughter-in-law were becoming harder to dismiss as paranoid imagination. The birthday party concluded with Charles offering to personally escort Catherine and the children back to their residence, despite the short distance and the availability of royal protection officers. This unprecedented gesture raised eyebrows among family members and staff, but Catherine accepted gratefully, clearly desiring additional time alone with Charles. During the brief car ride, their conversation was stilted and careful, both acutely aware of the driver's presence and the need to maintain appropriate boundaries. However, the underlying tension between them was so strong that even simple exchanges about the children's upcoming school activities felt charged with emotional significance. The following day brought a development that would accelerate the crisis beyond anyone's ability to control it. Camilla confronted Charles directly about his behavior toward Catherine, demanding explanations for changes in his demeanor and priorities that had become impossible to ignore. The Queen Consort's accusations were specific and devastating. She had observed the special attention he paid to Catherine's opinions, the way he sought opportunities to spend time with her, and the obvious emotional investment he had developed in their relationship that went far beyond appropriate family interest. Charles's attempt to dismiss Camilla's concerns as unfounded jealousy was undermined by his own inability to deny the accuracy of her observations. When pressed about whether he had developed romantic feelings for Catherine, his hesitation before responding told Camilla everything she needed to know. The confirmation of her worst fears triggered an emotional breakdown that revealed the depth of her own insecurity about their marriage and her terror of losing the position she had fought so long to achieve. The confrontation between Charles and Camilla lasted for hours and covered decades of relationship history, unresolved resentments, and fundamental incompatibilities that they had been ignoring or managing rather than addressing. Camilla's accusations extended beyond Charles's current feelings for Catherine to include his emotional withdrawal from their marriage over the past year and his obvious dissatisfaction with their life together. Charles, finally, forced to examine his feelings honestly, acknowledged that his relationship with Catherine had awakened emotions he had thought were no longer possible for him to experience. The king's admission that he was indeed falling in love with Catherine created a crisis that threatened to destroy multiple relationships simultaneously. Camilla's immediate demand that he choose between his marriage and his infatuation forced Charles to confront decisions he had been avoiding for months. Her ultimatum, that he must either commit fully to their marriage by ending all personal contact with Catherine or accept that their relationship was over, crystallized the impossible situation he had created through his emotional involvement with his daughter-in-law. Charles spent the sleepless night following his confrontation with Camilla walking the grounds of Clarence's house, and trying to imagine a future that could accommodate his feelings for Catherine while preserving the stability of the monarchy and his family relationships. Every scenario he considered involved devastating consequences for people he cared about. Ending his marriage to Camilla would create a public scandal that could damage the crown's reputation and betray a woman who had sacrificed greatly for their relationship. However, attempting to suppress his feelings for Catherine and return to his marriage felt like denying the most authentic emotions he had experienced in years. The next morning brought another crisis when William requested an urgent private meeting with his father. The Prince of Wales had become increasingly concerned about subtle changes in the family dynamic and had begun making inquiries that revealed the growing tension between Charles and Camilla. William's questions were direct and uncomfortable, particularly his observation that Catherine seemed unusually preoccupied with royal family matters and had been asking detailed questions about Charles's interests and activities that seemed beyond normal family curiosity. Charles faced an agonizing choice about how much to reveal to William about his emotional state and the crisis threatening both his marriage and the family's stability. His son's obvious concern for Catherine's well-being and his own confusion about recent changes in family relationships made the conversation particularly painful. Charles realized that William suspected something was wrong but hadn't yet identified the specific nature of the problem, creating an opportunity for damage control if he could manage the situation carefully. The king's decision to be partially honest with William while withholding the most damaging details represented a desperate attempt to maintain some control over an increasingly chaotic situation. He acknowledged that he and Camilla were experiencing marital difficulties and admitted that he had developed a closer relationship with Catherine than might be entirely appropriate. However, he stopped short of revealing the full extent of his feelings or the intensity of the crisis he was facing. William's response to his father's partial admission was both supportive and deeply concerned. As heir to the throne, he understood the public implications of any instability in the king's marriage, while as Catherine's husband, he was alarmed by suggestions that his wife was somehow involved in his father's personal problems. His request for time to speak privately with Catherine about the situation created additional complications, as it would force her to address questions she was entirely unprepared to answer. The conversation between William and Catherine that evening was emotionally devastating for both of them. Catherine found herself unable to deny that her feelings toward Charles had evolved beyond appropriate family affection, while being terrified to admit the full extent of her emotional involvement. William's growing understanding of his wife's internal conflict created pain and confusion that threatened their own marriage's stability. His realization that both his father and his wife were struggling with inappropriate feelings for each other represented a betrayal that challenged his fundamental assumptions about their family relationships. Catherine's tearful confession that she had developed feelings for Charles that she couldn't control or explain forced William to confront the possibility that his marriage might be collateral damage in his father's emotional crisis. The revelation that both his father and his wife were questioning their current relationships simultaneously created an impossible situation where William felt powerless to protect either his family's stability or his own emotional well-being. The fourth phase of Charles's emotional journey concluded with the recognition that his feelings for Catherine had created a crisis that could no longer be managed privately. Multiple relationships were now at risk, family members were demanding explanations and decisions, and the emotional pressures that had been building for months were threatening to explode into public scandal. Charles understood that he would soon be forced to make choices that would fundamentally alter not just his own life, but the lives of everyone he cared about. As the crisis deepened, both Charles and Catherine realized that they could no longer deny the reality of their mutual feelings or continue pretending that their relationship could remain within appropriate family boundaries. The question was no longer whether their emotional connection was real, but rather what they were prepared to sacrifice to honor it, and whether love could justify the potential destruction of everything they had built over decades of service to their families and the crown. The meeting that would change everything took place in the blue drawing room at Buckingham Palace on a rain-soaked Thursday morning in late autumn. Charles had requested that Catherine come alone, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for the Christmas court, but both understood that their real purpose was to finally address the feelings that had been growing between them for months. The formal setting seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what they needed to discuss, yet the privacy it offered made honest conversation possible for the first time. Catherine arrived 20 minutes early, using the extra time to walk through the palace corridors and steel herself for what she knew would be a life-changing conversation. Her marriage to William had been under increasing strain since his confrontation with her about her feelings for Charles. While William had not explicitly forbidden her continued contact with his father, the tension in their household had become unbearable. Every interaction with Charles now required careful justification, while her inability to suppress her emotions had created a distance between her and William that threatened their family's foundation. Charles had spent the previous evening writing and discarding multiple versions of what he wanted to say to Catherine. His marriage to Camilla had effectively ended 3 weeks earlier when she had moved out of Clarence's house following their final confrontation about his feelings for Catherine. While they continued to maintain public appearances together for the sake of the monarchy's stability, their private relationship was finished. The queen consort had made clear that she would not tolerate sharing her husband's affections with another woman, particularly not their daughter-in-law. When Catherine entered the blue drawing room, Charles was standing with his back to the door, looking out at the palace gardens through rain-streaked windows. The weight of recent events was evident in his posture, the slight slope of his shoulders, the way he held his head, the careful stillness that suggested barely controlled emotion. When he turned to greet her, Catherine saw exhaustion and pain in his expression, but also a resolve that suggested he had reached some fundamental decision about their impossible situation. Their initial conversation was careful and formal, both struggling to find appropriate words for feelings that defied conventional expression. Charles began by acknowledging the damage their relationship had already caused to family harmony and expressing his regret for putting Catherine in such a difficult position. His attempt to shoulder full responsibility for their emotional entanglement was immediately challenged by Catherine, who insisted that her feelings were genuine and chosen, not manipulated or coerced. The moment when their careful politeness finally broke down came when Charles said Catherine's name with such tenderness that pretending their relationship was merely familial became impossible for both of them. Her response, reaching for his hand and holding it while looking directly into his eyes, created the first moment of acknowledged intimacy between them. The physical connection, simple as it was, represented a crossing of boundaries that both had been resisting for months. Charles's confession of love, when it finally came, was delivered with the weight of a man who understood he was choosing between his heart and everything he had been taught about duty and propriety. He told Catherine that she had awakened feelings in him that he had thought were permanently buried, that her presence in his life had shown him what authentic happiness felt like, and that continuing to deny these emotions was destroying his ability to function effectively as either a king or a man. His words were careful and considered, but infused with passion that made their sincerity undeniable. Catherine's response was equally measured but emotionally devastating. She revealed that her feelings for Charles had been growing for over a year, that she had tried repeatedly to suppress them out of loyalty to William and respect for family harmony, but that denying these emotions had become impossible. Her description of the intellectual and emotional connection she felt with Charles, contrasted with the increasing distance in her marriage to William, painted a picture of a woman torn between duty and desire in ways that mirrored Charles's own internal conflict. The conversation that followed their mutual confessions lasted for over 3 hours and covered every aspect of their impossible situation. They discussed the potential impact on the children, whom they both adored and wanted to protect from the chaos their relationship could create. They analyzed the constitutional implications of the king's divorce and remarriage to his daughter-in-law, acknowledging that such unprecedented circumstances could threaten the monarchy's stability. They wrestled with questions of morality, loyalty, and the right to pursue personal happiness when doing so could harm innocent people. Despite the overwhelming obstacles they identified, both Charles and Catherine found themselves unable to consider ending their relationship before exploring whether it could somehow survive and flourish within the constraints of their circumstances. Their love for each other, now acknowledged and validated, felt too precious and authentic to sacrifice without exhausting every possible option for preservation. The question became not whether they loved each other, but whether that love could justify the risks and sacrifices required to honor it. Charles's decision to begin divorce proceedings against Camilla was announced to Catherine during their conversation, a revelation that both thrilled and terrified her. The king explained that his marriage had become unsustainable regardless of his feelings for her, that the emotional distance and fundamental incompatibilities could no longer be hidden or managed. However, he also acknowledged that his love for Catherine had accelerated his decision to end a relationship that had been declining for months. The most difficult aspect of their conversation involved planning how to manage their revelation to family members and, eventually, to the public. William's reaction would be crucial, as his support or opposition could determine whether their relationship could survive the inevitable scrutiny and criticism. The impact on the children required careful consideration, as both Charles and Catherine were committed to protecting George, Charlotte, and Louis from adult problems while maintaining their important relationships with their grandfather. Catherine's decision to request a separation from William represented the conversation's most dramatic moment. She told Charles that living a lie had become impossible for her, that pretending her marriage was fulfilling while being in love with another man was destroying her mental health and her ability to be a good mother. Her commitment to honesty, even at enormous personal cost, convinced Charles that her feelings were as serious and irreversible as his own. The practical planning that concluded their meeting focused on timing and damage control rather than whether to proceed with their relationship. Both understood that their love story would create unprecedented challenges for the monarchy and require them to navigate completely uncharted territory. However, their commitment to each other and their belief that authentic love was worth fighting for had overcome their fears about public reaction and family disapproval. Charles's announcement to William 3 days later was conducted in the king's private study at Windsor Castle, with both men understanding that their conversation would fundamentally alter their relationship forever. William's initial reaction combined shock, hurt, and anger in ways that Charles had expected but found difficult to witness. The prince's accusation that his father had stolen his wife's affections was particularly painful, though Charles understood the justice of his son's feelings. The conversation between father and son lasted for hours and included William's detailed concerns about the constitutional crisis their relationship could create, his fears about the impact on his children, and his personal devastation about the betrayal he felt from both his father and his wife. Charles's attempts to explain the unexpected nature of his feelings and Catherine's equal surprise at their development provided little comfort to a man who felt his family was being destroyed by circumstances beyond his control. William's eventual acceptance of the situation came not from approval but from recognition that both his father and his wife had made irreversible emotional commitments that could not be undone through argument or pleading. His request for time to process the changes and his insistence on protecting the children from unnecessary trauma reflected his maturity and his understanding of the broader implications for their family and the monarchy. The public announcement of Charles's separation from Camilla was made 6 weeks after his conversation with Catherine, carefully managed to minimize damage to the crown's reputation while acknowledging the reality of their failed marriage. The subsequent revelation of his relationship with Catherine, announced after a decent interval, created the expected media storm but was handled with dignity and transparency that helped manage public reaction. Catherine's transition from Princess of Wales to King's companion and eventual second wife represented a journey unprecedented in royal history. Her grace under enormous pressure, her commitment to the children's well-being, and her obvious love for Charles helped win public acceptance for a relationship that initially seemed scandalous. The wedding ceremony, conducted 18 months after their initial confession of love, was small but deeply moving, representing the triumph of authentic emotion over conventional expectations. The children's adjustment to their new family structure proved easier than anyone had anticipated. George, Charlotte, and Louis maintained loving relationships with both their father William and their step-grandfather-turned-stepfather Charles, while developing a special appreciation for the happiness their mother had found in her unexpected love story. William's eventual remarriage to a woman who understood and supported his unique family circumstances provided stability and demonstrated that multiple forms of happiness could coexist within their complicated family structure. Charles's reign as king continued successfully, with Catherine's support providing energy and purpose that enhanced his effectiveness as a monarch. Their partnership, built on mutual respect, shared values, and deep emotional connection, proved that love could indeed conquer the most challenging circumstances when approached with honesty, courage, and commitment to those affected by difficult decisions. Their story became a testament to the power of authentic emotion to transform lives and create new possibilities even in the most constrained circumstances.